Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this session. I'm very pleased to see so many of you here in COP26. This event is organised by Climate Action Network Europe, SNV Netherlands Development Organisation, and the European Think Tanks Group. So very pleased to welcome 2 in-person speakers today in the studio and 3 remote speakers. Just briefly, I'll give them a proper introduction later. We have Matthias Frumery, the head of the Swedish delegation to the UNFCCC. We have Jacqueline Masao from Climate Action Network Tanzania. And our remote speakers are James Murumbedzi from the UN Economic Commission for Africa. We have Gabriela Jacobuta from the European Think Tanks Group and the German Development Institute. And we also have Jean joining us from SNV Netherlands Development Organization. So today we're going to be looking at supporting green and climate resilient development from local to global level through the EU-Africa Partnership Strategy. Just before we get started, a couple of pieces of housekeeping. We have 45 minutes for this session, so I'm going to ask if the speakers can keep their interventions quite crisp, and then we'll have time for questions and answers from the audience in person and remotely. So just before I pass to our first speaker, I think we as the organisers have been looking at the EU-Africa partnership because we see the real potential for the EU and AU to build a stronger partnership around climate objectives from local to global level while advancing social justice objectives and global equity. And as the Climate Action Network, we've been engaging from past commissioners' meetings to the recent Foreign Affairs Ministerial in Kigali, and now looking ahead to the summit end of February. So it's a really timely moment to have this discussion, and looking forward to hearing from the speakers. So I'd like to start first with our remote speaker, Gabriela Jacobuta from the European Think Tanks Group. And she works for the German Development Institute. She researches environmental governance with a particular look at climate mitigation and the SDGs. And she's going to take us through a kind of context-setting introduction and introduce some key themes and policy areas, which I hope will kick us off for a good discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for your introduction, and many thanks to the EU Pavilion for this opportunity to co-organize and to speak in this event. This past almost 2 years since COP25 have represented a very difficult period for the world at large due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This period has put an enormous strain on socioeconomic systems, and not the least in Africa and also in the European Union. In this context, the EU and Africa seek to keep climate change as one of their priorities. In the next slide, I would like to present key strategies that the EU and the AU have developed in this context. First, the African Union is guided by the Agenda 2063, which includes a clear goal of developing green and climate resilient societies. Following this priority, the African Union recently released its COVID-19 strategy, which is a green recovery strategy prioritizing issues such as climate finance, renewable energy, biodiversity, climate resilient agriculture, and green and resilient cities. On the other hand, the EU released its Green Deal at COP25, covering issues of green energy, circular economy, sustainable agriculture, biodiversity, and sustainable consumption and production. The Next Generation EU package seeks a green recovery for COVID-19, addressing climate and biodiversity. And moreover, in this multi-annual financial framework of 2021-2027, the EU requires all instruments to allocate 30% of the finance to climate, including the neighboring development and international cooperation instruments, the so-called NDC, which is particularly relevant to this cooperation between EU and Africa. In the next slide, looking at African countries' NDCs, we see that climate activities put forward by African countries contribute to mostly all SDGs, all of the Sustainable Development Goals. In that sense, quite importantly, the NDCs are not only climate plans, but they are also sustainable development plans. Here we show an analysis of the NDC-SDG connections tool, a tool developed by the German Development Institute and the Stockholm Environment Institute, which extracts countries' future climate activities from their NDCs and categorizes them based on the SDGs. In the case of African countries, we see that NDC activities focus in particular on areas of energy, food security, biodiversity, and importantly, in the case of this event, partnerships. What is less addressed are the social SDGs, however, such as health, poverty, inequality, and governance and institutions. And some of these SDGs could be negatively affected by climate change and also by the green transition if this is not implemented justly. Something that Rachel has just mentioned, the importance of justice and equity in this case. Overall, it is important to mention that in the NDCs, there are more adaptation activities than mitigation activities, many of which are conditional on financial support. However, to date, climate-relevant finance has focused on mitigation rather than adaptation. In the case of the EU, there is a much better balance between adaptation and mitigation overall, but with fluctuations across years. In the next slide, to support the EU-Africa partnership, the European think tanks, groups, and its members have released a series of policy briefs, of which I would like to present a couple to you now, which I also co-authored. One of them is called A New Multilateralism for the Post-COVID World, What Role for the EU-Africa Partnership? And this was led by Claude Teven from ECDPM. A second one is the Green Transition in Africa-Europe Relations, What Role for the European Green Deal? Led by Christina Hakanesh from the German Development Institute. And finally, I would also like to mention that the South African Institute for International Affairs has released a series of policy briefs on EU-Africa partnerships, of which, together with my colleague Maximilian Högel, we published one on sustainable energy transition, so with that focus. In the next slide, I will quickly summarize a few key messages from these policy briefs, which I hope will act as a conversation starter for the panel following in this event. First, green transitions have the potential to support Africa-Europe cooperation by combining the climate agenda with an innovative social economic project for sustainable development. This is because there are common interests and interdependencies between EU and AU, which are very high. The comprehensive strategy with Africa put forward by the EU recently envisions the EU and the AU as partners for sustainable growth and jobs and partners for a green transition. Second, green transitions are key topics in the African Union and the European Union. Both are committed to implementing the 2030 Agenda and the Paris Agreement, and are seeking to implement the necessary strategies for that. However, the EU and the AU, in the next point, approach green transitions from very different angles. Whereas the EU has a major historic responsibility and continues to have very high per capita emissions, the African countries have contributed very little to climate change and in addition will be severely affected by its consequences. Moreover, the AU's Agenda 2063 gives very strong priority to poverty reduction and climate adaptation, whereas the social dimension of the European Green Deal is much more limited in that regard. Acknowledging these differences will need to be starting point for identifying priorities. In order to make cooperation on green transitions fruitful for AU and EU relations, an eye-level partnership is needed, whereby both parties acknowledge each other's priorities. This is necessary in order to gain each other's trust and jointly identify common interests. Neither Europe nor Africa has a blueprint for carbon neutral societies and economies. Cooperation on green transition, therefore, provides opportunities for joint learning, and there should be a focus on such an exchange in the future. Finally, the EU should engage with African countries to formulate a common and mutually beneficial vision and position for the international climate and environmental negotiations. Particularly, this concerns decisions on the post-2020 biodiversity framework and on the post-2025 climate finance targets and reporting standards, whereby it is particularly important to Africa to have stronger provisions on adaptation, for instance. To end, the presented policy briefs explore 6 particularly relevant fields in more detail. These are energy transitions, the circular economy, trade, climate change adaptation, in particular in the agricultural sector, climate diplomacy, and financial instruments. As I said, these key messages hopefully will act as a conversation starter for the following panel, which will go in more detail on EU-AU cooperation. And I look forward to the discussion. Thank you very much to all of you for having me here.
Thanks very much, Gabriela. I think that was really useful in terms of setting up the discussion and providing us some context. I'd like to pass over to the next speaker on our panel, who is Dr. James Murumbetsi, and he is a climate advisor at the UN Economic Commission for Africa. A bit about his background: he's a global expert on land and resource rights and how they affect rural stakeholders and local governance in Africa. And he's previously held positions with the UN Development Programme. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, and I'd like to invite you to give some reflections from the work that UNECA has done, particularly on the Green Recovery Action Plan. Thanks and welcome.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Good afternoon, and thanks to the EU Pavilion for this opportunity to participate in this very important conversation. So allow me to pick up from where Gabriela left off. Gabriela did in fact give us a very good context, and she indicated in particular that the EU and the AU approach green transitions from significantly different perspectives. So I want to focus a little bit on the African priorities, particularly at COP26 and going forward, using the context that Gabriela just set out for us. The first point to make, I think, is that COP26 must certainly deliver several very important and very urgent outcomes. From the European perspective, it must put in place mechanisms for accelerated progress towards achieving net zero. And this is historically important for Europe because of the contributions to the historical carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. And this means, among other things, that the developed world should immediately begin to put in place societal and economic adjustments to allow for effective capital reallocation away from fossil fuels, but also to make available compensation mechanisms to address the socio-economic impacts of climate change in developing countries. And these are issues related to the broader context of financing climate actions. For Africa, of course, climate actions around adaptation more than mitigation, for reasons that I'll come to shortly. In terms of the pledged finance, I think it's clear now that the promised $100 billion a year will not be realized until 2023, which is 3 years behind schedule. And in any case, the $100 billion is grossly inadequate to address the adaptation needs of Africa. And we can put the figures up for discussion. But what this means immediately is that, of course, in order to deliver climate finance, COP26 must ensure that Article 6 is concluded and successfully concluded and finalized in ways that would at least operationalize both market and non-market mechanisms to mobilize climate finance, but also to create carbon markets which are capable of producing viable global carbon prices. And the ECA thinks that a global carbon price of at least $50 per ton would actually allow African countries to mobilize around $30 billion per annum. Still grossly inadequate, but a considerable contribution from the market towards the finance needs for African adaptation to climate impacts. In addition, the COP should also put in place mechanisms to valorize Africa's natural resources and ecosystems, which contribute significantly to carbon storage. These include the African forests, peatlands, wetlands, grasslands, and so forth. Again, with a significant carbon sequestration value, but which continue to be undervalued or undervalorized, so to speak. The second priority that I would like to focus on is the question of energy, which again Gabriela referred to in a context. So Africa is indeed energy impoverished. And if we are to achieve the dual objective of recovering from COVID-19 in a green way, but also achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, then without a doubt, the energy gap has to be resolved and resolved urgently. The continent's average per capita electricity consumption, for example, is only about 600 kilowatt hours per year, compared with a world average of 3,200 kilowatts, almost 3 times the African average. The European Union average is 6,100 watts per year, while for China it's close to 5,000 watts. So you can see that there's very little electricity consumption on the African continent per capita. In terms of power plants, Africa's total installed capacity is about 230, 240 gigawatts, which is only 12% of that for China, for instance. So Africa needs to increase very significantly and very rapidly its installed energy generation capacity, as well as its consumption, in order to meet the objective of universal access to electricity by 2050. But the continent is conscious that this needs to be done without adding significant greenhouse gas concentrations into the atmosphere. And now here is the challenge for COP26. The net zero transition for developed countries comes with very tough conditionalities, including the defunding of coal, oil, and gas investments. Now, this is very significant for Africa because, in fact, if Africa should achieve universal access by 2050, that means increasing its capacity by 6% per year, every year until 2050. And this cannot be done using renewables. Again, this has been adequately demonstrated. However, the continent can, in fact, actually achieve universal access by using natural gas as a transitional fuel. And there are many advantages of using gas. Firstly, gas, in fact, actually reduces emissions because it moves investments away from coal. Secondly, natural gas can, in fact, actually, beyond facilitating phasing out more polluting fuels, it can increase the share of gas in the energy mix, while at the same time only marginally raising emissions to 4.5%, for instance, by 2040, which is very, very insignificant compared to the potential from other fossil fuel sources. And if this happens, if Africa is in fact allowed to invest in gas, this is going to more than triple its annual power generation to somewhere around close to 3,000 terawatts, and gas would double its contribution from 2018 to 2014, and that would constitute about 30 times the current share of wind and solar power. So in fact, there are many significant advantages of investing in gas, but as we have already stated, this needs COP26 at least needs to ensure that there are no stringent conditionalities that are placed on investment in gas to ensure that, in fact, Africa can use natural gas as a transition fuel to 2040, 2050. And finally, the whole question of investment in nature-based solutions. I did indicate in the opening that Africa is home to massive ecosystems that store significant amounts of carbon dioxide. But these ecosystems are under immense pressure, firstly from poor African communities, secondly from investments, national and international, and thirdly from climate change itself, in terms of the impacts of climate change on ecosystem integrity. And there needs to be significant investment in the sustainable management and use of these ecosystems to ensure that they continue to be viable carbon sequestration systems. And for this to happen, there also needs to be a significant increase in climate finance and a diverse focus in climate finance from simply adaptation to include support for African livelihoods to ensure that communities' livelihoods and ecosystems are all sustainable at the same time. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Murrumbetsi, for introducing some priorities from the UNECA perspective. And I'd now like to pass to our in-person speakers, starting with Matthias Frumery. As mentioned, he's the head of the Swedish delegation to the UNFCCC and has a breadth of experience working in the Environment Ministry as well as the Foreign Affairs Ministry, I understand, as well as EU and Africa. So very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts on the EU's and Sweden's perspective on the partnership and what the European Green Deal can look like for international cooperation and partnership. Thanks.
Thanks very much for this opportunity to be with you today. And just coming back to the title of this event, I think it's for the EU and the AU to be joining forces on climate action would provide us with a very strong voice globally to advance and accelerate climate action, which I think all of us here at COP26 would really want to see that as an outcome of the meeting and obviously something going forward as well. So I think there's great potential in really strengthening that partnership between the EU and the African Union, and also, of course, between the EU member states and individual AU member states. So working both sort of on the regional level as well as bilaterally. Just picking up on some of the points which have been briefly mentioned here during the conversation so far. I mean, I think working on all kind of areas where we strengthen the access to renewable energy, I don't think I would be agreeing with the previous speaker on having gas as a sort of a transition solution for energy, but rather making sure that we have access to renewable energy being expanded across not only Africa, but also, of course, in Europe itself. So I think that's a clear area of cooperation between the EU and the AU. But also looking to other areas where, as you said, the European Green Deal can be a point of departure for how we cooperate between the EU and the AU in making sure that we integrate climate action and environment more generally into sort of the work of our two institutions, but also within our bilateral relationships. I think that's sort of a key aspect, which will also, in turn, I believe, help us mobilize the finance needed for the transition. The more so we have built in both climate action and the more general environmental perspectives into our, for example, national budget and planning processes, the more we will also be able to mobilize the resources needed for the transition. I was very happy to see in the initial presentation the linkages between the NDCs and the SDGs. And I'm happy to see, of course, that the Stockholm Environment Institute's scoreboard was part of that presentation. I think that's also sort of one of these key elements where the EU and the AU can be working together to enhance those linkages. And I think that also speaks to sort of the way of integrating into our national processes to make sure that we have the NDCs and the SDGs being part and parcel of the kind of policies we want to see developed in order for us to be able to take climate action further. Just briefly as well on the AU Green Recovery Plan, where Sweden is proud to be partnering with the AU on specifically when it comes to biodiversity. I think that's also something which we hope to see coming out strongly from this COP, working together with sort of the UNFCCC and the CBD process to ensure those kinds of linkages. On adaptation, which has been mentioned here as well, Sweden is a proud member of the Champions Group for Adaptation Finance, where we hope to engage more and more members as well, to see more donors coming out in supporting the needs and priorities of developing countries in integrating adaptation and making sure that there is finance available for adaptation, to strike that kind of balance between mitigation and adaptation finance, which we do in our Swedish bilateral cooperation, where we see as a response then to the priorities set by developing countries. And just finally, I think in terms of what we want to see as a result coming out of COP26, and here I hope that the EU and the AU can be supporting that kind of result, both highlighting the urgency of climate action, but also at the same time the opportunities in climate action, where we see obviously the need for a just transition and making sure that we're, according to the SDGs, or in line with the SDGs, that everyone is on board on the kind of transition that we want to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thanks for that perspective from the EU. I would like to invite our next speaker, Jean, if she's available. Jean Muthamia Mwenda. So Jean works for the SNV Netherlands Development Organization, and she's the global lead on youth employment and entrepreneurship. She has over 15 years professional experience working with youth and in international development. And so I'd like to ask you, Jean, to give us some insights on how youth can be supported to engage in green and climate resilient development through the AU-Africa partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you so much for having me. To respond to your question, I would like to highlight that young people in Africa are increasingly becoming aware of the causes and effects of climate change. They are innovatively identifying concrete green business opportunities. They are improving their livelihoods as a result of that, and they are transforming communities where they are living. But this transformation and youth engagement in supporting green and climate change resilience development will not happen in a vacuum. Young people need support, guidance, and are counting on leadership of the countries where they're living. To reinforce this message, I would draw an example from one of SNV's green projects implemented in Ghana on slide 3. And the Boosting Green Employment Enterprise Opportunities project in Ghana is a 5-year investment by the EU and is implemented by SNV and UNCDF. The project aims to contribute to sustainable and climate resilient local economies, green jobs, and development, mainly for young people, women, and returning migrants. On slide 5, we illustrate the OYE push, match, pull, enable model or approach that is applied to address this topic and the challenge on youth employment and entrepreneurship in the countries where we are working. We'll also showcase a video right after this that also gives more information on the OYE push, match, pull, enable approach. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that. And so as a result of implementing the green project in Ghana and other projects that are implemented by SNV and other partners focusing on youth employment and green jobs and the evolving sector in this economy, we'd like to share a few takeaways and what is needed to create more sustainable impact on youth employment and entrepreneurship development. On slide 6, I would like to showcase a couple of those lessons learned as key takeaways. Number 1, there's need for us to promote more and create awareness on the benefits on climate change and the green circular economy at local, regional, national, but also at global levels. We see increasingly, yes, people and communities are becoming more aware of what is happening in the communities where they are as a result of climate change, but we need to stimulate more conversations, create more awareness, and engage communities on what this means. In addition to this, and as we work with young people, we also need to work more and invest on contextualized or tailored training materials or resources that enable young people to identify concrete opportunities that are sustainable within this new evolving economy. As I speak right now, I'm actually speaking from Kenya, where we are doing exactly this. One of SNV's, one of the programs implemented by SNV and also an investment by the Dutch government to scale has invested heavily on a new curriculum that is applicable and youth-centered. And some of the topics that we are addressing in this new curriculum actually are climate change and youth employment. What opportunities are there? And how can young people tap into those opportunities? We are also looking at green digital innovation and also positioning agriculture as the future sector for employment for young people in Africa. The other takeaway that I would like to highlight as part of this conversation, and this has also been mentioned by other speakers as well, is that partnerships are crucial. So the role of private sector and public sector also becomes very important as we create sustainable environments, but also enabling environments that support youth-led enterprises to thrive. But this support and improvement will not happen in a silo. There's partnerships that is needed. We need to support the private sector and the public sector as well, so they can develop and improve on green practices, so then they can be able to provide more employment opportunities for young people. As well, we know that young women specifically face major barriers as they enter into the world of work and the world of enterprise development. So more attention and innovative approaches are needed as on how we engage and target young women going forward in our programming and also in our conversations on policy dynamics, but also on how we support them as they go along the economic development pathways. Another key takeaway that I would like to highlight before I conclude my remarks is that implementable policies are needed to support youth-led enterprises, but also to support young people to be able to identify opportunities that are sustainable, but that are also economically viable. In most of the countries where we're working as SNV, we see that policy development is not the problem, it's the implementation. So there's need for us to invest more, to partner more with the different countries to understand where the gaps are and what is needed for us to put those policies into perspective and make them more implementable so that young people can then be able to benefit from that. And as a result, then we all collectively contribute to a conducive enabling environment that is conducive for young people to thrive. My concluding remark is that at the core of this conversation, we need to put young people at the center of this discussion on climate change, the causes, the opportunities, and what solutions are needed. Because more often than not, we say that young people are the future, but we see them as the leaders of today. So they should be at the core of the conversation on climate change and the solutions that are needed going forward. On the last slide, I provided information on what is, if there are questions, you can contact us on the last slide. Those informations, that information is provided there. Thank you, Rachel. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Jean, for those insights on implementation and the role of youth. I'm afraid we won't have time to show the video today, but it is being shared via our social media channels. So I encourage everyone to watch that to see an example of the youth project from SNV. I'd like to pass to our final speaker, who's Jacqueline Masal from Climate Action Network Tanzania. So very pleased to have her as a colleague from the CAN network. So Jacqueline is a meteorologist with a master's in meteorology science, and she is both. She has experience both from the field in terms of working as a field engineer, dealing with installation of weather stations and weather data management, but she's also working at Climate Action Network Tanzania, looking at projects that aim at building climate resilience of vulnerable communities. And it would be great if you could give us some insights on your work looking at Tanzania and African countries' national climate plans, adaptation plans, and loss and damage. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you to the EU for inviting me to speak on this event. Well, first I would like to acknowledge the African need to this COP, but also the African need back home. Our stand is still on adaptation and loss and damage, and what we think this partnership, the AU-EU partnership, it needs to deliver to support us all is to be able to use our local solutions, but also first to acknowledge the difference in priorities that the previous speakers had mentioned. EU being on renewable energy, that is the mitigation part, but as Africans being on the adaptation part. So we also think that through this partnership and in these differences that we could use mitigation interventions as to support our adaptational needs. That way it becomes a win-win situation for both of the parts of within the partnership itself. But also the interlinkages of having the mitigation options, interventions serving the adaptation needs, it will also lead to the interlinkages of across different goals within the sustainable development goals, but also the implementation of our plans, being it the NDCs, the Agenda 2063, but as well as the national adaptation plans that we have at different national institutions. With that, the focus also needs to still be that these interventions, whatever they are, they need to be local-led and with support on technology and capacity building to actually enhance Africa's adaptability to climate change, and as well as considering the loss and damage issues. So with that, I'll just end there. Thank you.
So thank you very much to all our speakers. We have limited time left for questions, but I'd like to invite the remote audience to put any questions through Slido, which you can see in the app that you're using, as well as using the QR code on the platform. And in the meantime, I'd like to see if we have any questions from the floor, and we have roughly 7 minutes or so for questions. So perhaps I see two over here. Let's take the first two questions from the lady and the gentleman here, and then I'll invite responses from our speakers.
I do not necessarily have a question, but I just wanted to highlight the importance of civil society within the partnership. A lot has been talked about, and the last speaker online talked about the issue of having the private sector on board and many other actors. I think it's also critical that civil society is within that partnership for the reasons that civil society is located at the last mile and the center of climate change effects and solutions. So, and of course we'll see this through what happens practically, things to do with engaging, planning at different different levels, national and community level, household level. They are also present. Civil society is present at NDC policy formulation and review.
Thank you. Thanks. I think we'll have to move on if you could just wrap up. Thank you.
I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that important aspect. I think we can take quickly the gentleman, and we have a question coming through Slido.
My question will be, one, my name is Fahad Mato, CAN Network Uganda. All parties to the Paris Agreement committed to do something to do with promote and cooperate in terms of technological transfers.
Okay.
I've not had any EU members address the same.
Mm-hmm.
And about the technological transfer, what would be the effect in terms of patents and industrial property of different innovations? I think it's high time that we can address those challenges before Africa can get up.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. So I'll just read out a couple of points that have come through on the Slido as well, which is about the role of cultural heritage in tackling climate change. And also a question about the summit, which is planned for February, and expectations that there might be for that moment itself. The summit's been a long time in the making. And it's, excuse me, the lady here, did you want to make a quick point? Or?
Yes, so I'm Keith Treadwell working with WWF. I was wondering about the mentioning of gas. We have a lot of false solutions out there. How can the EU-AU partnership help communities avoid false solutions which could lock in stranded assets and let communities be empowered to adopt decentralized renewable solutions, which can obviously bring a lot of benefits to communities as well as deliver on the climate goals?
Okay, thank you very much. So we have very limited time left, so I'd just like to invite all the speakers to pick one aspect they might want to comment on, from technology transfer, false solutions, cultural heritage, or the summit itself, which I'd be keen to hear about. So perhaps I start with you, Jacqueline? And please make it very short. 30 seconds.
Well, the role of cultural heritage in tackling climate change, as I had spoken before, having the local led interventions that still consider this cultural heritage. So the technology that we expect from the partnership or that comes in from Africa, it needs to just support our own interventions. That way it gets, we own it, but also it supports our own culture and our own heritage and development through that. And no, it does not make us run back and try to adapt to something else that we are not familiar with, and that is not sustainable. So as I had suggested, these local-led interventions and even the technology coming in needs to actually be able to support that, to ensure that our culture, heritage, as well as our traditions are also being upheld within.
Great. Thank you. I'd now like to pass to Gabriella and then Jean for final words. And if
Yes.
I'm being told that we have to wrap up. So I'm really sorry about this. Perhaps I could just take two last comments, one from Dr. Marimbetsi and one then from Matthias in the studio.
Yes, thank you. So I would like to comment on the sort of the issue around renewable energy and gas as a.
And if you could keep it to a minute. Thank you.
Yeah. So 1 minute. Gas as a transition fuel and renewable energy. I think this is a very important debate and one that has to be resolved at this COP. Significantly, what Africa is saying is that in the long term, the continent would like to make the shift to renewable energy. But in the interim, that shift cannot in fact be made while at the same time addressing the continent's immediate energy needs in order to power the continent's industrialization agenda. Without power, the continent cannot industrialize. Without industrialization, the continent cannot meet its sustainable development goals. And the whole question then is that what constitutes a just transition for Africa is a transition which enables the continent to catch up in terms of industrialization and improving the livelihoods of the continent's citizens, while at the same time in the long term contributing to global climate goals. Recalling, of course, that the continent has contributed only 3%, even less to global greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere.
Okay.
So this is a crucial.
Thank you. I think we're
question.
going to have to move on. I'm sorry to cut you off, but we're going to have to leave the room shortly. Thank you so much. I'll just pass finally to Matthias for a word to wrap us up.
Just very briefly, I think in terms of the summit next year, I think hopefully we can build on the results from COP26 and ensure a strong partnership between the EU and the AU on climate action, potentially also highlighting the importance of civil society and youth in delivering that and supporting that kind of action, and maybe highlighting the kind of examples we see on technology transfer and cooperation. For example, the Beyond the Grid Fund for Africa, where Sweden and the Nordic countries have been supporting the installment of renewable energy off-grid solutions in many countries throughout Africa. So just a few sort of highlights of what we might be able to see in terms of results from the summit.
Okay. Excellent. Thanks again to all our speakers, and thanks to the audience. I think that was a very enlightening session in terms of insights on local to global action, and thanks for joining us. Please check out SNV, CAN Europe, and the European Think Tanks Group for more information. Thank you.